The air inside the King's Ridge warehouse in Birmingham didn't move. It was a stagnant, gray mist that smelled of wet wool, coal soot, and the sweet, cloying scent of rotting sugar. It was February 1945, and the British winter was a damp weight that pressed against the corrugated steel of the hangar. Inside, the silence was absolute, yet it was deafening. It was the silence of 7 million voices. They were trapped in millions of envelopes, stacked in sagging wooden crates that reached 30 feet into the darkness of the rafters. Letters from mothers in Ohio, telegrams from wives in New York, and packages of Christmas cakes from a world that felt 1,000 years away. Major Charity Adams stood in the center of this cathedral of lost mail. She was 30 years old, her uniform crisp despite the humidity, her eyes scanning the mountain. This was the backlog the United States Army had declared unsolvable. The silence was shattered by the heavy rhythmic thud of a general staff car pulling up outside. The door groaned open and a high-ranking officer strode in, his face tightened by the stresses of the Ardennes and the Rhine. He didn't look at the letters. He looked at the women, black women in WWII uniforms, and he saw a political experiment he didn't care for. "I want a parade, Major," the general barked. "I want your unit in formation for an inspection. Now." Adams didn't move. She looked at the crates. She knew that every hour spent polishing boots for a parade was an hour that a soldier at the front went without hearing he had a newborn daughter. "Sir," she said, her voice a calm, resonant strike against the cold. "The mission is the mail. I will not pull them off the line." The general's face flushed a deep, dangerous red. "Major, if you don't have those women in formation, I will send a white officer to show you how to run this unit." Adams didn't flinch. She stepped into his space, a major facing a general, a black woman facing the embodiment of Jim Crow military authority. "Over my dead body, sir," she replied. The general stared at her. In that moment he realized he wasn't looking at a subordinate. He was looking at the only person in the European theater who could fix the greatest psychological crisis facing the American soldier. History is written in the blood of the infantry and the steel of the tank, but it is fueled by something far more volatile: morale. By 1945, the American war machine was a titan, but its heart was beginning to falter. The invisible crisis had taken hold. 7 million pieces of mail were backlogged in Europe. In a war where death was a daily arithmetic, the letter was the only thing that kept a man human. Without it, he was just a serial number in the mud. The Army Postal Service had collapsed. The men assigned to it were overwhelmed, disorganized, and increasingly indifferent. The solution the War Department settled upon was the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion. It was the first and only all-black, all-female unit sent overseas. To the Pentagon, they were a convenience, a way to satisfy the demands of the black press while burying a hopeless task in a warehouse where failure wouldn't make the front pages. They gave Charity Adams a job no one wanted. They gave her the mountain, and waited for her to buckle. They expected the 688 to disappear into the soot of Birmingham, a footnote of administrative failure. But Charity Adams understood a truth the generals had overlooked. She understood that logistics is the highest form of compassion. She understood that every letter was a pulse, and her unit was the heart that had to pump it back into the veins of the army. This is not a story about clerical work. It is a story about a leader who took a unit of women who were told they were second-class citizens by the very country they served, and turned them into the most efficient logistical machine in the history of the U.S. military. This is the story of how Charity Adams made the impossible to ignore. To understand the steel in Charity Adams, you must look at North Carolina in the 1920s. She was the daughter of a minister and a teacher, intellectuals who lived in a world where their skin color was legally defined as a deficit. In the Adams household, education was a weapon of war. Charity graduated high school early and finished Wilberforce University with honors. She was a scholar of psychology, a student of how the human mind reacts to pressure. When the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAC, opened its doors in 1942, Charity didn't join for the uniform. She joined for the opportunity to prove that the Negro problem, as the military called it, was actually a white perception problem. She was part of the first officer candidate class at Fort Des Moines. The training was a study in psychological friction. These women were being trained to lead, yet they were forced into segregated barracks. They were taught military law by instructors who, in many states, wouldn't allow them to vote. Adams was a natural. She was precise, demanding, and possessed a quiet authority that didn't require shouting. She was promoted to major, the first black woman to hold that rank in the U.S. Army. In 1944, the male crisis reached a breaking point. General Eisenhower's staff reported that mail was the #1 concern of the troops. More than food, more than ammunition. A soldier who feels forgotten by his home is a soldier who loses his will to fight. The 6,888th was formed out of necessity. 855 women, handpicked for their literacy, their stamina, and their discipline. Adams' design for the unit was based on 3 pillars: discipline, detection, and durability. They trained in the freezing mud of Kentucky, doing gas mask drills and long marches. Adams knew that if they went overseas and failed, it wouldn't just be a military failure. It would be a setback for her entire race. You must be twice as good, she told them, to be thought of as half as much. On February 3, 1945, they boarded the SS Isle de France. The crossing was a nightmare of U-boat alerts and Atlantic gales. When they finally arrived in Birmingham, they found a city broken by the Blitz and a warehouse that was a literal graveyard of paper. The design of the operation was a 24-hour cycle. 3 shifts. 8 hours on, 16 hours off. The lamps in the Kings Ridge warehouse would never go out. Adams implemented a search matrix. They weren't just sorting, they were hunting. They had to find Robert Smith, in a theater of 7,000 Robert Smiths. They used serial numbers, middle initials, and hometowns to map the 7 million names in their directory. They were the Google of the 1940s, powered by index cards and the sheer, stubborn will of women who refused to be the failure the Army expected. The combat for the 6,888th began with the rats. The warehouses in Birmingham were infested. The rodents had grown fat on the packages of spoiled food, Christmas cakes, cookies, and candies that had sat in the damp heat of the hold for months. The smell was a physical barrier. The women had to wear heavy coats and gloves not just for the cold, but to protect themselves from the filth. The ridicule was more subtle but more poisonous. White units nearby questioned why these colored girls were there. Military police would stop them on the streets, demanding to see their papers, refusing to believe a black woman could be a major. Inside the warehouse, the mountain loomed. 7 million pieces of mail. Some of it was 2 years old. There were letters addressed to men who had been buried in the soil of France for 6 months. The white postal units that had preceded them had given up. They had labeled the pile unsortable. They mocked Adams' 3-shift system, calling it busy work. They expected the women to quit within a month. But Adams used the ridicule as fuel. She was a psychologist. She knew that nothing builds a unit's bond like a common enemy. She made sure their barracks were the cleanest in Birmingham. She made sure their uniforms were the sharpest. Every night, the women would stand at the sorting tables, their breath visible in the air, their fingers stiff with cold. Fwack, fwack, fwack. The sound of envelopes being tossed into wooden cubbies. It was the rhythm of a machine. They found letters addressed simply to Buster, U.S. Army. They would scour the directory, cross-referencing every Buster, until they found the right one. They were detectives of the heart. The mockery began to fade as the numbers started to move. In the first month they cleared 2 million letters. The mountain was shrinking. The outbound trucks were leaving fuller every day. The soldiers at the front were starting to get mail postmarked from Birmingham. The ridicule was replaced by a nervous silence from the high command. They had given Charity Adams the job no one wanted, and she was making them look incompetent by comparison. The confrontation with the general was the moment the 6,888th ceased to be an experiment and became a legend. The general didn't care about the 2 million letters they had cleared. He cared about the fact that a black unit was operating with an independence he found threatening. He wanted to break the unit's focus and remind them of their place in the hierarchy. When he demanded the parade, he was intentionally sabotaging the mission. He knew that a full unit inspection would shut down the sorting lines for a day. "Major," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous warehouse, "you are here to be a military unit. A military unit parades. 8 o'clock tomorrow." Adams stood her ground. She was surrounded by the mountain, by the smell of rotting paper and the tireless thwack-thwack of her women working. "Sir, the mail is the mission. We have a backlog of 5 million still to go. My women are on 3 shifts. If I pull them for a parade, the soldiers at the front don't get their mail. I will not do it." The general's response was the ultimate insult. "I will send a white officer to show you how to run this unit." In the history of the U.S. Army, few subordinates have ever spoken the words Charity Adams spoke next. She didn't shout. She didn't lose her bearing. She simply spoke a truth that was backed by 7 million pieces of paper. "Over my dead body, sir?" The general was stunned. He was looking at a court-martial offense. But he was also looking at a woman who knew she was indispensable. If he relieved her, the unit, which was fueled by their loyalty to her, would stop. The mail miracle would die and he would be the man who killed it. He turned and left. He never sent the white officer. He never asked for another parade. Later he sent a memo. It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission. He wrote that the 6,888th was the most efficient unit of its kind in the European theater. Charity Adams had won. She had proven that the mission was more important than the ego of a general. She had taught her women that their value was not in their salute, but in their work. The 6,888th cleared the Birmingham backlog in 3 months, half the time the Army had estimated. The technology of the 6,888th was the Central Directory. It was a massive, analog database consisting of 7 million individual 3x5 index cards. Every soldier in the European theater had a card. But the cards were often wrong. Units were destroyed, reorganized, and moved overnight. The tactic Adams developed was continuous reconciliation. The women didn't just look at the card. They looked at the dead letter files, the hospital reports, and the casualty lists. If a letter was addressed to a soldier who wasn't in his unit, they would search the hospital records. If he wasn't there, they would check the replacement depots. They also managed the V-Mail Victory Mail system. This was a marvel of 1940s engineering. 1. Compression. To save shipping space, letters were written on special forms and then photographed onto 16 mm microfilm. 2. The scale. A single sack of microfilm could hold 150,000 letters. Without V-Mail, the mountain would have been a continent. 3. The processing. The 6,888th had to blow up the microfilm, printing it back onto paper so it could be delivered. The most emotionally taxing tech was the Kia stamp. Charity Adams insisted on a triple check for any letter marked "killed in action." She knew that a mistake could destroy a family. 2 different clerks and 1 officer had to verify a name on the official casualty list before the stamp could touch the envelope. They were processing 65,000 pieces of mail per shift. That is 195,000 letters a day. This was the industrial-scale management of human emotion. They weren't just moving paper. They were moving the psychological data of the American people. In May 1945, as the war in Europe ended, the 6,888th was moved to Rouen, France. Rouen was a city of ghosts. The warehouse was a bombed-out shell. The mountain here was even larger, filled with mail for soldiers who were moving so fast they couldn't be caught. Here they encountered a crate of lost mail from 1940, letters from the original British Expeditionary Force that had been trapped when France fell. For 5 years, those letters had sat in a German-occupied basement. The 6,888th didn't just archive them. They tracked down the families. Even after 5 years, they ensured those voices were heard. In Rouen, the women worked by flashlight. The generators were unreliable and the French rain was constant. They faced a new challenge, the victory chaos. Millions of men were being sent home, while others were being sent to the Pacific. The directory was changing by the hour. Adams implemented a mobile sort. She sent teams of women directly to the ports and the cigarette camps, to sort the mail on the fly. They were no longer just in a warehouse. They were a rapid response unit. They cleared the Rouen backlog in record time, then moved to Paris. By the time they were done, the 6,888th had processed 17 million pieces of mail. They had defeated the invisible crisis. The strategic impact of the 6,888th was massive. General Eisenhower later said that the mail was the most important factor in the morale of the troops. By clearing 17 million letters, the 6,888th had essentially performed a massive psychological repair of the U.S. Army. A soldier who gets a letter from his mother is a soldier who is 20% more likely to follow orders. A soldier who knows his wife is safe is a soldier who is less likely to suffer from combat fatigue. The production of the 6,888th was a form of industrial power. They were the processors at the heart of the American information network. Strategically, they also won a battle for the future. Their success was documented by the black press and sent back to America. It became the empirical evidence that the military used to justify desegregation in 1948. Charity Adams hadn't just cleared a warehouse. She had cleared a path for every black soldier who would come after her. The return home was not a celebration. In 1946, the 6,888th was quietly deactivated. There was no parade in New York. There was no congressional gold medal, not yet. Charity Adams early returned to a country where she was still a second-class citizen. She had been a lieutenant colonel, the highest rank for a black woman, but in her hometown she was still expected to step off the sidewalk for a white man. The aftermath was a decades-long silence. The women of the 6,888 went back to their lives. They became teachers, doctors, and activists. They used the discipline they learned in Birmingham to lead the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. The reflection we are left with is one of moral irony. These women fixed the heart of an army that didn't yet have a place for them. They served a democracy that was, for them, still a promise rather than a reality. Charity Adams died in 2002. She lived long enough to see the first monuments to her unit. She remained modest to the end. "We didn't do it for history," she said. "We did it for the boys." Today, the Kings Ridge warehouse in Birmingham is gone, replaced by modern glass and steel. But if you stand in the quiet of a cold winter morning, you can almost hear it. The thwack 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 of the sorting. The low hum of 855 voices. The scratch of a pen readdressing a letter to a foxhole in Germany. Charity Adams early was given the job no one wanted. She was given a mountain of paper and a battalion of women the world had written off. And she proved that leadership is not about the stars on your shoulder, it is about the dignity of the work. She made the impossible, impossible to ignore. The mail went through. And because it did, 17 million connections were made. 17 million hearts were warmed. And one woman proved that no matter how much the world tries to silence you, your work can speak louder than any general's command.